In the last video, we focused on how um, one, collusions operate, but then essentially how fragile they are in that firms are going to have a very large incentive to cheat, right? They can very easily increase their profit by going against the agreement that they made as part of joining the collusion. This situation where um, is each individual within an interaction faces an incentive to defect, right? To cheat in some way, to go against their agreement, that is indicative of what we call a prisoner's dilemma game. And that, especially in the sense that going against their agreement is going to make everyone involved worse off, right? For the firm that is cheated on, right, their profit falls, so that's very clear. For the firm that cheats, even though their profits increase, what we're going to see is that their cheating introduces a fundamental instability into that collusive agreement. And so likely what happens is once they cheat, all the other firms in the collusion cheat as well. And so it very quickly unravels. The price falls close to, if not all the way to their marginal cost of production, such that now the profits they're earning are zero or close to zero, and they are significantly worse off. All right. And so that incentive to cheat sets in motion this unraveling of their exclusive agreement that hurts all of the firms involved, right? Obviously, consumers would be happy about it, right? They get more of the good that they want for a lower price, increasing their consumer surplus. But when we're speaking about modeling collusive agreements as prisoner's dilemmas, we're focused on the experience and returns that the firm enjoys. All right, so we're focused on the producers here. Okay, so the textbook definition of prisoner's dilemma, you can see it on the slide here. It's a situation in which the Nash equilibrium is an outcome that is somehow worse for all involved than another outcome which is unstable. Okay, so that in our collusion, cooperation is unstable, cheating is the Nash equilibrium, right? That's what we expect to happen. And just a reminder on what Nash equilibrium means. Nash equilibrium refers to the state of affairs where each player does not want to change their behavior given what the other players are doing, right? So as a singular player will not change what they've done given the other person's actions, all right? In game theory, the prisoner's dilemma is usually modeled, as you can see in the 2x2 matrix on the slide here. Oh, sorry about the zooming. I don't know why I did that. Okay, there you go. So this 2x2 matrix is the usual way that we present or model prisoner's dilemmas in game theory. Traditionally, most game theory games have two players. You can expand the number of players, but at a basic level, it's always two. And there are a few conventions I want to note before we move into the analysis here. So for game theory, this 2x2 matrix is the normal form of a game. That's what we call it. Player one is always, always, always shown on the left, right? So player one is always on the left. Player two is always on the top. Okay, so that's the norm. Player one is always on the left. Player two is always on the top. And so when we show the payoffs, which are the numbers in the cells, what that means is that the left number is always the payoff for player one, and the right number is always the payoff for player two. Okay, and that's going to extend to other forms of games, other ways of modeling games that we'll see for chapter 12. But for right now, we're going to stick with the normal form. So what we can see here, this is a standard prisoner's dilemma game. We have player one and player two facing the choice to either cooperate or defect. If player one cooperates and player two also cooperates, they each get a payoff of -1. If player one cooperates and player two defects, then player one gets a payoff of -5 and player two gets a payoff of 5. If player one defects and player two cooperates, player one gets a payoff of 5, player two gets a payoff of -5. And finally, if both defect, then they each get a payoff of -3. Okay. So sorry. Oh my goodness. Okay. Sorry about that. So that is how we read this normal form table. All right. There's a little bit of a story that usually goes along with the prisoner's dilemma game. I can go ahead and tell you that here. Basically, the prisoner's dilemma game is usually um, thought of as being around two folks who have committed a crime, right? Maybe they've robbed a bank, right? And so our two folks who have robbed this bank, they've been caught and they're placed in an interrogation room by the police, and they're each placed in a separate room. All right, that's important. So in this game, these two players, they've previously cooperated. They robbed the bank together. Now they're caught. And so the question is, do they cooperate with each other and stay silent? Don't tell the police anything, right? Or do they defect? Do they rat their partner out? All right. The police will usually, and this is very standard, the police will usually offer them some incentives to make ratting their partner out attractive. Okay, so that's what those payoffs are representing. Okay, so starting with that cell where they both cooperate, that is going to be where they both keep their mouths shut. They don't tell the police anything. And so as a result, they're incarcerated maybe for a year, right? The world where player one cooperates and player two defects, player two gets off scot-free. They don't serve any time, but player one is incarcerated for 5 years, right? Player one takes the entire blame and punishment for the robbery. In the world where player one defects but player two cooperates, the outcome is reversed. So player one gets off scot-free. Player two, in contrast, is incarcerated for 5 years, right? That player gets the entire punishment for the robbery. In the world where they rat on each other, both of them are being incarcerated, not for 5 years, but for much longer than if they had kept their mouth shut, right? They're both incarcerated for 3 years. So what we're going to see happen is that naturally, just by the incentives that each individual faces, the game is going to end up in that defect cell, right? That is the Nash equilibrium of our game, even though both players would prefer to be in the cooperate cell. What we're going to see is that in a world where player one cooperates, player two wants to defect. And knowing that, player one is also going to want to defect. All right, because if they cooperate while player two rats them out, they get the book thrown at them. And so they're trying to avoid that. All right. So if we look at our payoffs here, this is going to be, I'm going to model for you the standard way that we analyze one of these games. We're going to start with player one and we're going to look at player one's options. All right. So player one, if player two cooperates, they want to defect, right? Because we're comparing here their payoffs from cooperating to their payoffs from defecting when player two cooperates. All right. So player one's going to choose defect in that case. All right. If we look at when what player one wants to do when player two defects, we're going to see the same outcome, right? Now player one is comparing these two payoffs, right? They get -5 if they cooperate and -3 if they defect. And so again, player one is going to choose defect. And so that is going to be what player one chooses every single time, regardless of what player two does, right? Every single time, player one is going to rat out their partner in this game. Okay. Now let's look at player two. We're going to start by saying, okay, suppose player one cooperates. What does player two want to do? Oops, sorry, wrong one. this one. If player one cooperates, what does player two want to do? They're comparing -1 to +5. They're going to pick +5, right? They want to get off scot-free, so that means they're going to defect. Now let's compare for player two their payoffs if player one defects, which we know they're going to do. For player two, they're comparing -3 and -5, right? -5 if they cooperate, -3 if they defect. -3 is smaller than -5, so they're going to choose defect. And so both of our players here have the dominant strategy of defecting. Every single time that will be better for them to do, regardless of what player one does. Okay. And so they both defect and they end up in this equilibrium that is not optimal, right? They're both incarcerated for 3 years, whereas if they had both kept their mouth shut, they could be incarcerated for only 1. All right. But neither of them has the incentive to cooperate, despite that better option, that better outcome, excuse me. And so they're just always going to end up in this suboptimal equilibrium. All right, defect. What we'll talk about when we get into game theory is organizations that face this type of prisoner's dilemma usually come up with ways to change the payoffs that players face so that cooperation is maintained. Okay, but we'll look at those in a minute and further in chapter 12 as well. All right, but this prisoner's dilemma describes a cartel well because that is exactly the incentive that collusions face. Cartel members want to cheat, right? They're better off cheating when the other cartel members don't, right? When the other cartel members cooperate. And that's true for every single member. And so what they're all going to do is cheat. And so they're all going to be worse off, right? The price is going to fall because they're all producing more than the agreement and they're eroding their own profits. Here's another example. So this is an advertising game. What you're going to see is that it is a version of a prisoner's dilemma. So we have Disney and Warner Brothers both have produced a movie, and they're deciding when they release it whether or not they're going to advertise, right? They share the same audience for this movie, and if they advertise, they're going to take viewers from each other, right? Rather than getting folks both viewing both movies, they're going to have the same people watching the movie, but now they'll have spent money advertising, right? So that's the idea. If one of them advertises, then it's good because they get all the viewers, but the other one doesn't. But if they both advertise, then they both get the same amount of viewers, but now they've taken on the cost of advertising. Okay, so that's the game we're playing here. So for Warner Brothers and Disney, if they both cooperate, so this don't advertise is our cooperation cell. If they both cooperate, then they're saving the cost of advertising for themselves and still getting the same viewers that they would otherwise. And so their profits are 320 million, right? Let's say that. If one of them advertises and the other does not, then the person who advertises gets more of the audience, right, rather than it being split between the two, and they earn 550 million in profits, while the other one takes on the costs of advertising, while the other one loses out, even though they don't take the cost of advertising, because they don't get much of an audience at all, right? So they lose out 80 million, right? They're making a loss. If they both advertise, then like I said before, they're still splitting their audience, but now also taking on those costs of advertising. And so we see that they both earn 250 million instead. Okay. So that advertises our defect option. Let's go ahead and analyze our game. What will be the Nash equilibrium? Warner Brothers is our player 1. Disney is our player 2. Warner Brothers, if they don't advertise and Disney doesn't advertise, they earn, oops, sorry about that, 320 million. If Warner Brother advertises when Disney doesn't, they earn 550 million. So their preference here is to advertise. Okay. They want to maximize their profits, right? Disney, right? If we look at the world where they don't advertise and Warner Brothers doesn't advertise, is going to also earn 320 million, right? If Warner Brothers continues to not advertise, then Disney earns 550 million. So their preference is also going to be to advertise, right? Regardless of if Warner Brothers advertises or not, they're better off, right? Because if we then look at the other cells between don't advertise and advertise for Disney, they're better off advertising when Warner Brothers does. Similarly, Warner Brothers is going to be better advertising when Disney does, right? Because rather than earning negative 80,000, they earn 250, million. And so both of them are going to have a dominant strategy of advertising, right? It wins out every time. Because if they don't advertise, the other one will, and they'll earn a loss. Okay. And so both of them end up in this advertise equilibrium where they're earning a profit, but they're earning 70,000 less, 70 million less than they could. Okay. So they would both prefer to be in the don't advertise cell, but it's unstable, right? Because of the incentives they face. And so they both end up advertising, they split their audience, as well as take on those additional costs. So again, this is another example of a prisoner's dilemma. Our next question, which we've already sort of discussed, is what can collusions do, right? How can they prevent this cheating from happening? Clearly, they're going to know that it's going to be a temptation, right? The people making the collusion, coming to that agreement, are the same people who are going to face that cheating incentive. And so what they're going to want to think about is what will serve as means of effectively monitoring their cartel partners, and what will serve as an effective means of enforcing their agreement. Okay. Generally, when it comes to effective monitoring and enforcement, the 4 items listed on the slide work really well. Right? These include government regulation, some sort of binding agreement that is enforced in a court system, ostracism from a group, or potentially loss of market access. All right. When it comes to collusion and cartels, they're illegal, right? So generally, government regulation, not going to work, right? There might be ways where a set of firms or a small subset of firms can get protection against new entrants, and that will help with maintaining the collusion. Taxi cabs in New York, especially before Uber, were really good at this because the taxi cab medallions were required to operate the taxi. And if you tried to drive a ride-sharing service without a medallion, you would be physically assaulted, right? Those cab drivers enforce their market power, right? They enforce that barrier to entry. And so that type of government regulation is allowed, is legal, and so that's going to be effective. And what we also saw with those taxi cab drivers in New York pre-Uber is that they enforced how much people could drive, right? So that number of hours is their output. And the way that they did that is through the central organization that monitored and dispatched rides, right? And so they could see how much individual drivers were working and identify who was going over the agreement, right? Because those restricted hours are necessary to keep the price up. That taxi cab system in New York also served to be a binding agreement, right? Because if a driver drove more than they were supposed to, they would face some sort of backlash from the dispatch service. Okay. And so they had an incentive to abide by that agreement. And if they didn't, they would likely be either forced out of the market, they wouldn't, they would be ostracized, the dispatch likely wouldn't give them rides, or they would be pushed out entirely, right, and lose their ability to drive. So taxi cabs historically, especially in New York, have been very good cartels, right? The entrance of Uber sort of shattered that, right? Now it's much harder for those taxi cabs to maintain these collusive agreements that they had before. They try, but because now they're competing with Uber, where drivers can just choose to drive at any given time, the number of them is restricted, but there's still much more flexibility than there was with the taxi cabs themselves. Means that these collusions operate much less well. All right. We're going to look at an example here. Another example, if I can get this video to play for us. Let me pause it and share the sound so you all can hear it as well. Okay. You should be able to hear this. If you don't, I will include the link to this on the page on Canvas so you can watch it on your own device.
Today, we're going to learn more about game theory by using it to solve a simple problem. Bob and Al are two prestigious rival magicians who have developed a new trick that is quite popular. They then agree to limit performances so they can charge more. If both magicians perform only one show a week, each will earn $10,000. However, if one magician breaks the agreement and performs 5 times a week, while the other continues to perform once a week, that double crosser will make $15,000, while the other magician will make only $1,000. And if both magicians break the agreement and perform 5 times a week, each will earn $6,000. So what is the Nash equilibrium of how many shows they will each perform? The Nash equilibrium means that no person has an incentive to change their behavior or strategy unless someone else changes their behavior or strategy. In order to find the Nash equilibrium of Bob and Al's performances, we have to first analyze Bob's behavior based on Al's behavior, and vice versa. It'll be easier to track everything if we fill out a 2x2 matrix. There are 2 individuals with 2 options. In each box of the matrix, we'll list each person's payoff given the state of the world. So we'll list Bob's payoff first and Al's second. So let's first look at Bob's best strategy based on Al's behavior. Al will either keep her promise to perform once a week, or she'll break her promise and perform 5 shows. If she cooperates and performs 1 show, what is Bob's best strategy? Again, if we just look at what he stands to gain, then his best option would be to cheat and perform 5 times a week and make $15,000 versus performing once a week and making $10,000. Now, what if Al backstabs Bob and performs 5 shows? Bob's best strategy here is also to perform 5 shows a week and make $6,000 versus performing once a week and making only $1,000. Given that Bob's best strategy is to cheat and perform 5 shows, regardless of what Al does, cheating is his dominant strategy. Now, let's look at it from Al's perspective. I bet you can see where this is going. If Bob keeps his promise and performs 1 show per week, then Al's best option is to perform 5 shows. She'll earn $15,000 instead of $10,000. And if Bob decides to break his promise and perform 5 shows, Al's best option is also to cheat and perform 5 shows because she'll earn $6,000 instead of $1,000. Given that Al's best strategy is to perform 5 times per week, again, regardless of what Bob does, this is also considered her dominant strategy. So if Bob's dominant strategy is to cheat as well, then the Nash equilibrium in this game is for both of them to break their promises. They'll each perform 5 shows and earn $6,000. Notice that this isn't an optimal outcome. It would be so much better for them to each perform only one show per week. They'd earn a lot more money, and they'd also have a lot more free time on their hands. But if we're just evaluating what to do from the payoffs listed in our matrix, it is in both Bob's best interest and Al's best interest to cheat. Thus, it's the Nash equilibrium. Of course, there's a real world outside of the matrix. The world is much more complicated than this. People care about keeping promises, and they think about the long run rather than just week to week. So think of this example as just a simple but powerful starting point to better understand human decision making. As always, let us know what you think. And if you'd like more.
So this video comes from Marginal Revolution University. They have great resources, especially for principals. So if you're still feeling like you need principals' help, I highly recommend their videos and their website because they have interactive practice materials as well. All right, but let's stick with this example of Bob and Al and think through how Al and Bob might enforce their collusion. All right, so like the video said, they are facing a prisoner's dilemma, right? Initially, these payoffs aren't accurate here. Initially, they're facing 10,000 each if they only perform once a week. But because they have the incentive to cheat, and that's both of their dominant strategy, they end up in the cheat cell, meaning that they only earn 6,000 a week. All right. So we want to think through what will allow them to move from the cheating cell to the one where they're both cooperating. And in game theory, what that requires is having some element of the game change such that the payoffs change and incentivize cooperation. Okay, so at the end of the video, they mentioned how people in the real world care about keeping promises. They're thinking about long run returns, not just week to week. They might introduce, other rules or commitments or bring in third parties to help enforce their agreements as well, right? If you think about your group projects, it's a prisoner's dilemma, right? How do you ensure that not everyone just sort of defects and decides not to do the work, right? One thing that motivates at least one person is usually the grade, right? They want to ensure that they get a good return from the course, from that project. And so they're going to keep their promise to contribute. Another thing besides the grades that helps is potentially the threat of the professor coming in, right? In this case, me, and enforcing the group's shared commitment, right? Saying that, oh, I'm going to grade you all individually. So if you don't contribute, I'll know, and that's going to affect your individual grade. By the way, I will know from your presentations who did most of the work and who just showed up. Okay. In case you needed that extra push. And so we want to think about, those four elements that I discussed previously that can help collusions persist. What can Al and Bob do in this case, right? They're essentially an oligopoly trying to enforce a cartel, a collusion. What can they do? What can they implement in order to change their payoffs such that they have the incentive to cooperate, right? And those payoffs would need to look something like is shown on the slide here, that 20K, right? Because if they both earn 20K by keeping their promise, then they have no incentive to cheat, right? Because if Bob cheats while Al is keeping their promise, Bob is actually earning less, right? So Bob and Al are going to stick in that promise when the payoffs are changed to reflect what you see on the slide. So what can they do? First, right, there might be that moral or social compulsion. I made a promise, I'm going to keep it. That being said, morals are great. Not always the best at enforcing promises or cooperative behavior, right? For some people they work, for many they don't. And so we want to think about what more formal or rigid solutions we might implement. So if we think about Al and Bob, they're magicians, Magicians are in a very small community, right? So most magicians who are practicing professionally, they know each other. This is true of a lot of professions, right? Once you get up into the higher levels, when you become an expert in something, usually you know the other folks in that industry. And so, what will likely be the case is that Al and Bob are one of many magicians, and they all know each other. And so, there's going to be this reputation mechanism at stake, and that can help enforce their agreement, right? So, if Al and Bob, they've created this new trick, they both agree only one show a week. What is likely to happen if one of them cheats, the other one will surely find out, and they're going to tell everyone. They're going to tell everyone in that magician community. And what happens to the cheater? They are not able to work with anyone ever again, right? And potentially the person who is cheated on goes to all the venues, tells them how shady of a character the cheater is, and that cheater, right? Maybe Al cheated. Al's never able to book a gig again, right? Because, or at least not a good one, because all of the venues know this person doesn't keep their promises, right? And so that threat of ostracism that is facilitated by their reputation is going to incentivize Al and Bob to keep their promise. And so the payoffs are going to look more like we see on the slide than what was shown in the video, right? Such that they both have an incentive to keep their promise. What we might also see is if they submit some sort of patent or intellectual property agreement that is enforced by the government, and that stipulates that they are only allowed to perform that trick once a week. And so through that government regulation, which if violated can be enforced through the court, both Al and Bob are going to face, again, payoffs like we see in this table and not the one from the video, meaning that they keep their promise. Okay. Um, Additionally, they might agree to hire a third party to just monitor them and keep track, and both agree that if they violate their agreement, if they perform more than once a week, they have to pay the other some portion of their earnings, right? And in that way, we're going to see the payoffs change such that cheating is no longer benefiting the person who cheated, but actually benefiting the person who cooperated, right? And so rather than both earning 2020 from cooperating, that is going to keep the payoffs from promises at 10,000, but it's going to change the payoffs from cheating, such that the person who cheats and it gets caught by that third party enforcer has to take some of their winnings and give it to the person who cooperated. So we might see maybe the person who cheats has to pay 11,000, or we could even say 10,000 is sufficient, and it goes to the person who kept their promise, who now earns 11,000. And so for the person who keeps their promise, they actually want the other person to cheat, right? Because they're better off. Whereas for the person who cheated, they're no worse off when that cheating is detected and enforced. And so we're going to see again, right, that keeping their promises is going to be the Nash equilibrium, right? Because that makes them both best off. All right, so those are some examples of how those collusions might be enforced between Al and Bob. With that, we're done with collusion, and our next video is going to look at Bertrand competition, one form of oligopoly.